In 1937, a penniless writer died in a Providence hospital, leaving behind a few dozen stories published in cheap magazines that cost 10 cents and were printed on paper so poor it yellowed within months. His lifetime earnings from fiction totaled less than $500. No major publisher had ever issued a book of his work. His obituary in the local newspaper occupied 3 brief paragraphs. 80 years later, that same writer's invented mythology permeates global culture. His creatures appear in films, video games, and novels by authors who have never read his original stories. His fictional grimoire, the Necronomicon, is so convincing that libraries still receive requests for it from people who believe it's real. The adjective formed from his most famous creation, Lovecraftian, has entered the English language as a standard descriptor for a particular species of cosmic dread. The writer was Howard Phillips Lovecraft, and the distance between his obscure death and his current ubiquity represents one of the strangest trajectories in American literary history. He lived almost his entire life within a few miles of where he was born, rarely traveling, never holding steady employment, supporting himself through ghostwriting and revision work that paid by the page. He married once, disastrously, and the marriage collapsed within 2 years. He had no children. He owned almost nothing when he died. Yet from this narrow, failing life emerged fiction that fundamentally altered how we imagine cosmic horror. Before Lovecraft, supernatural terror meant ghosts, vampires, demons, entities that operated within a recognizable moral universe where good and evil had meaning. Lovecraft imagined something different, vast, ancient beings utterly indifferent to humanity, for whom our existence was at most an irritating accident, at worst completely beneath notice. This vision emerged from a peculiar contradiction at the heart of his character. Lovecraft was a scientific materialist who understood that modern astronomy and biology had revealed humanity to be cosmically insignificant. Yet he was also a reactionary who desperately wanted the universe to conform to 18th century hierarchies and values. He rejected all religion as superstition while writing stories structured like religious revelation. He lived in the 20th century while trying to think and write as if it were still 1750. The stories he produced from this contradiction were unlike anything being published in the pulp magazines that occasionally accepted them. Where other writers provided clear resolutions and comforting moral frameworks, Lovecraft offered ambiguity and existential vertigo. His protagonists were scholars and investigators who discovered too much, learned things that shattered their understanding of reality, frequently ended their stories dead or insane or wishing they had never asked the questions that started their investigations. His most famous creation, Cthulhu, appears directly in only one story, but has become an icon of modern horror, instantly recognizable even to people who have never read Lovecraft's description of it. The creature represents something larger than itself, the idea that reality contains vast regions that human consciousness is not equipped to process, that knowledge itself can be dangerous, that the universe revealed by modern science is more terrifying than any traditional ghost story. But Lovecraft's legacy is complicated by facts that cannot be ignored or excused. His racism was not incidental or typical of his era, but extreme and obsessive, expressed in fiction and letters with a viciousness that disturbs even readers who admire his imaginative achievements. He married a Jewish woman while writing hateful screeds about Jewish immigrants. He formed genuine friendships with people his theories classified as racially inferior, the contradictions never resolved. Understanding Lovecraft requires holding multiple truths simultaneously, that he created genuinely original and influential fiction, and that he held reprehensible views, that he was capable of generosity toward young writers, and that he fantasized about racial purging, that he imagined cosmic perspectives that transcended human provincialism, and that he could not transcend the provincial prejudices of his own background. His life was marked by failures that would have destroyed someone less stubborn or less supported by family resources. He failed to complete high school. He failed at marriage. He failed at every attempt to find regular employment. He failed to earn a living from his writing. By conventional measures, he accomplished nothing and left behind nothing of value. Yet within a generation of his death, his work began to be recognized as something extraordinary. Publishers who had ignored him during his lifetime started issuing collections. Critics who would have dismissed pulp magazine fiction as beneath notice began writing seriously about his themes and techniques. Writers in multiple genres acknowledged his influence, incorporated elements of his mythology into their own work, recognized him as having open possibilities that previous horror fiction had not explored. The transformation from forgotten pulp writer to canonical author took decades and involved contingencies that might easily have gone differently. If August Derleth had not dedicated himself to preserving Lovecraft's work, founding a small press specifically to publish it when no commercial publisher was interested, the stories might have disappeared entirely. If the cultural moment of the 1960s counterculture had not made Lovecraft's alienation and cosmic pessimism suddenly appealing to young readers, his work might have remained obscure indefinitely. But the preservation succeeded and the reputation grew, and now Lovecraft occupies a permanent position in American literature, studied in universities, published by prestigious presses, recognized as having created something that transcends the pulp magazines where it originally appeared. What follows is the story of how this happened, how a neurasthenic recluse living in Providence, Rhode Island, writing stories that almost nobody read, created a mythology that would eventually saturate global popular culture. It is a story about creativity and mental illness, about genius and prejudice, about the strange relationship between an artist's life and their work's afterlife. It is the story of Howard Phillips Lovecraft, who wanted desperately to belong to the past and ended up defining part of the future. On August 20th, 1890, in a substantial Victorian house at 454 Angel Street in Providence, Rhode Island, a child was born who would die in obscurity 46 years later, leaving behind stories that almost no one had read. Within 50 years of his death, that same man would be recognized as one of the most influential writers of supernatural fiction in the English language. His invented mythology woven into the fabric of modern horror, his creatures and forbidden books becoming part of our collective imagination. Howard Phillips Lovecraft arrived into a world of privilege that was already beginning to crack. The house on Angel Street was not his parents' home. It belonged to his maternal grandfather, Whipple Van Buren Phillips, a successful businessman whose fortune came from manufacturing and real estate. The Phillips family represented old New England respectability, the kind built on merchant shipping and industrial expansion, on connections that stretched back through generations of Providence society. The child's father, Winfield Scott Lovecraft, was a traveling salesman for the Gorham Silver Company, frequently away on business trips that took him throughout the northeastern United States. His mother, Sarah Susan Phillips, had married somewhat below her station, at least in the eyes of her family. The marriage, formed in 1889, would last less than 5 years before shattering completely. But in those first months, as the baby Howard lay in his crib in the Phillips house, surrounded by his grandfather's library and his grandmother's anxious attentions, the future seemed simply uncertain rather than doomed. The house itself was large, filled with books, with the material comfort of upper-middle-class Victorian America. It was the kind of household where education mattered, where a child might be expected to amount to something. What no one could have predicted was that this particular child would spend most of his life in that same house or near it, rarely traveling far from Providence, writing stories that almost no one would publish, corresponding with dozens of amateur writers scattered across the country, and constructing in his imagination a cosmic horror so profound that it would eventually reshape the boundaries of the genre itself. The child who grew up in the Phillips house was not a normal child, though whether this was cause or effect remains unclear. Howard Phillips Lovecraft developed early, learned to read by age 3, and by 5 was already absorbing the contents of his grandfather's substantial library. This was not light reading. Whipple Phillips had collected the classics, the ancient texts, the scientific works of his era. The boy consumed them. He read the Arabian Nights and became obsessed with Oriental fantasy, declaring himself at one point a follower of Islam and taking the name Abdul al-Hazred. He encountered classical mythology and Roman history, devouring Ovid and Bulfinch. By age 6, he was writing his own poetry, crude imitations of the 18th century verse he had discovered. The library became his world, more real in some ways than the world outside. But this precocity came wrapped in illness, or what appeared to be illness. The boy suffered from what his family called nervous disorders, attacks of anxiety so severe that his mother would often keep him home from school. He attended Baker Street Grammar School sporadically, his attendance interrupted by mysterious ailments that doctors could never quite pin down. The pattern would persist throughout his childhood, periods of intense intellectual engagement alternating with collapses into invalidism. His grandmother, Roby Alzada Place Phillips, showered him with attention, perhaps too much attention. She read him Gothic tales, stories of horror and the supernatural that most adults would have considered inappropriate for a young child. He loved them. The imagery seeped into his dreams, creating nightmares so vivid that they remained with him for life. Creatures he called night gaunts would pursue him through dark landscapes, faceless beings with leathery wings who would pick him up and carry him off to unknown destinations. He would wake screaming. His mother responded to these episodes with increasing alarm, treating her son as though he were made of glass, constantly warning him about dangers real and imagined. She told him he was hideous, too ugly to be seen in public. She dressed him in ways that other children found strange. The relationship between mother and son was becoming something twisted, overprotective, and undermining simultaneously. Meanwhile, his grandfather Whipple provided a different model. The old man was practical, successful, a figure of authority in Providence business circles. He had built something real, accumulated wealth, commanded respect. For young Howard, he represented a kind of masculine competence that the boy both admired and knew himself incapable of matching. Whipple encouraged the boy's reading but also expected him to eventually become something useful, to contribute to the family business perhaps, to make his mark on the actual world rather than imaginary ones. This tension between the world of books and dreams and the world of business and practicality would define Lovecraft's entire life. He was being raised as a gentleman in a household where gentlemen were expected to be educated and cultured, but also in an era when gentlemen were increasingly expected to work, to justify their existence through productivity. The older model, the gentleman of leisure supported by inherited wealth, was becoming unsustainable. The Phillips fortune was not infinite. By age 8, Howard had discovered science, particularly astronomy. He read books about the solar system, about the nature of light and matter, about the vast distances between stars. The universe revealed through the telescope and the spectroscope was incomprehensibly large, ancient beyond human reckoning, indifferent to human concerns. This realization should perhaps have been terrifying to a sensitive child already prone to nightmares. Instead, it fascinated him completely. He began producing a handwritten periodical called the Scientific Gazette, filled with astronomical observations and facts copied from books and magazines. He was mimicking adult scientific discourse, teaching himself to write with precision and authority about objective phenomena. At the same time, he was composing poetry in the style of Alexander Pope, trying to master the heroic couplet, training himself in forms that were already considered archaic. The contradiction was telling. Here was a child absorbing cutting-edge 19th century science, understanding that the universe operated according to mechanistic laws, that human beings were infinitesimal specks on an unremarkable planet orbiting an ordinary star. Yet he was expressing himself in the literary forms of the 18th century, as if modernity and content could be contained within traditional form, as if the new knowledge could be domesticated by old structures. His formal education remained inconsistent. He attended Slater Avenue School for a time, then Hope Street High School, but his attendance was frequently interrupted by illnesses that appear, in retrospect, to have been at least partly psychological. He was learning more from his grandfather's library than from any classroom. The public school environment, with its noise and social demands, seemed intolerable to him. He preferred solitude or the company of adults who would discuss serious topics. What he was not learning, crucially, was how to interact normally with his peers. Other children found him odd, too formal, too wrapped up in subjects they considered boring. He found them crude, unintellectual, interested in games and amusements that seemed pointless to him. The mutual incomprehension was complete. He was developing into exactly the kind of person his own fiction would later feature, the isolated scholar, the man set apart from common humanity by knowledge and temperament, unable to connect. In 1893, when Howard was not yet 3 years old, his father Winfield Scott Lovecraft suffered a complete mental and physical breakdown while staying at the Butler Hospital in Chicago. The exact nature of the illness was never made entirely clear to the young Howard, though the truth was grimmer than anything he was told. Winfield had contracted syphilis, almost certainly during his travels as a salesman, and the disease had progressed to its tertiary stage, attacking his nervous system and brain. He was brought back to Providence and committed to Butler Hospital, the psychiatric institution where he would remain for the rest of his life. The official explanation given to the family and to young Howard was that Winfield had suffered from general paresis, a diagnosis that was technically accurate but concealed its syphilitic origin. In Victorian America, syphilis carried such stigma that families went to great lengths to hide it, even from their own children. Howard would never see his father again in any meaningful sense. Winfield lingered in Butler Hospital for 5 years, his mind destroyed, his body gradually failing. When he finally died in July 1898, Howard was 7 years old. The boy was told his father had died of overwork and exhaustion, a respectable death for a respectable man. The truth remained buried. The effect of this loss is difficult to measure. Howard barely knew his father, had no real memories of him as a functioning adult. The man existed for him primarily as an absence, explained by vague references to illness and tragedy. But the absence itself mattered. There was no male role model in his daily life except his aging grandfather. No one to balance his mother's increasing neuroticism. No buffer against her smothering attentions. Sarah Susan Lovecraft, now a widow in her 30s, threw herself even more intensely into raising her son. She had no other occupation, no other purpose. Howard became the focus of all her anxieties and aspirations. She was convinced he was delicate, special, in constant danger from the harsh world outside. She reinforced his growing sense that he was different from other children, set apart by sensitivity and intelligence that others could not understand. Then came the second blow. In 1904, when Howard was 13, his grandfather Whipple Van Buren Phillips died suddenly. The man who had provided stability and financial support, who had built the family fortune and maintained the Phillips position in Providence society, was gone, and almost immediately, the full extent of his financial failures became apparent. Whipple had lost massive sums in speculative business ventures. The fortune that had seemed so solid proved to be largely illusory. The estate was bankrupt. The house on Angel Street, the large Victorian home that represented everything the family had been, had to be sold. Sarah and Howard, along with Howard's two aunts, were forced to move to much smaller accommodations at 598 Angel Street, still in Providence but in dramatically reduced circumstances. For the teenage Howard, this collapse was catastrophic. He had been raised as a gentleman, educated in a household of books and culture, trained to think of himself as belonging to Providence's upper classes. Now, suddenly, he was poor. Not desperately poor, not starving in the streets, but poor in the sense that gentlemen understood poverty, lacking the means to maintain one's position, unable to live without thinking constantly about money. His response was to contemplate suicide. He would later describe standing by the Seekonk River, looking into the water, seriously considering whether life was worth continuing. What stopped him, characteristically, was not hope or religious faith, but curiosity. He had been reading chemistry, and he wanted to understand more. The desire to learn more about the material universe, to understand how things actually worked, pulled him back from the edge. But the damage was done. His already fragile sense of security was shattered. The world had revealed itself as fundamentally unstable, unable to be trusted. The pillars on which his life rested could collapse without warning. This lesson would shape everything that followed. He had to leave Hope Street High School before graduating. The official reason was a nervous breakdown, another in his long series of mysterious ailments. The real reason was probably the combination of financial pressure and psychological collapse. He needed to contribute to the household somehow, but he had no skills, no training for any profession, and increasingly severe social anxiety that made any kind of normal employment seem impossible, so he retreated. For the next several years, roughly from 1908 to 1914, Howard Phillips Lovecraft became a recluse. He stayed in the small house on Angel Street with his mother and aunts, reading voraciously, writing occasionally, but rarely leaving his room. He slept during the day and stayed awake at night, reversing his schedule entirely, living in darkness. His mother encouraged this retreat, treating him as an invalid, protecting him from a world that might hurt him. He was in his late teens and early 20s, the period when most young men were establishing themselves in careers, forming relationships, beginning adult life. Instead, he was living like a Gothic protagonist, isolated in a small house in Providence, sustained by a tiny income from his grandfather's depleted estate, reading 18th century literature and scientific journals, going nowhere, becoming no one. The outside world was changing rapidly. This was the era of industrial capitalism triumphant, of cities expanding, of new technologies transforming daily life. Automobiles were appearing on the streets. Electricity was becoming standard. The Wright brothers had flown at Kitty Hawk. Einstein had published his special theory of relativity. The world was accelerating into modernity. And Howard Lovecraft was living as if it were still 1750, writing poetry in Augustan couplets, immersing himself in colonial history, refusing the present. The contradiction between his scientific materialism and his cultural conservatism was becoming more pronounced. He understood that the universe was mechanistic, vast, indifferent. He accepted the findings of astronomy and physics, but he wanted to live as an 18th century gentleman in a world of order and hierarchy and traditional values that had never really existed except in imagination. In 1914, something unexpected happened. Howard Lovecraft, aged 23, emerged from his self-imposed isolation, not into the world of regular employment or normal social life, but into the peculiar subculture of amateur journalism. This was his first real step out of the house on Angel Street, though characteristically, it was a step into something eccentric and marginal rather than mainstream. Amateur journalism in the early 20th century was a thriving network of hobbyists who published small magazines and newsletters, circulated them among themselves, and held conventions where they could meet in person. These were not professional publications seeking profit or wide readership, but labors of love, created by people who wanted to write and publish without the constraints of commercial necessity. The movement had thousands of participants across America, from teenagers to retirees, united by their love of the printed word. Lovecraft discovered this world through a letter he wrote to a pulp magazine, The Argosy, attacking the quality of the fiction it published. His letter was eloquent, written in formal Victorian prose, dripping with contempt for modern popular literature. It caught the attention of Edward F. Dass, who was involved in amateur journalism and recognized in Lovecraft's pompous letter a potential contributor to the cause. Dass invited Lovecraft to join the United Amateur Press Association, and Lovecraft accepted. It was the beginning of his emergence from total isolation. Through amateur journalism, he would discover that he could write for an audience, even if that audience was tiny. He would form friendships, conducted almost entirely through correspondence, that would sustain him for the rest of his life, and he would begin, tentatively, to write fiction again. His contributions to amateur journalism were initially non-fiction, essays on writing style, on colonial history, on his beloved 18th century. He published a paper called The Conservative, in which he defended traditional values against modernity with all the force of his considerable vocabulary. He argued for classical models in literature, for proper grammar, for the preservation of Anglo-Saxon cultural heritage against contamination by immigrants and their inferior civilizations. The racism in these early essays was not subtle. Lovecraft believed wholeheartedly in the superiority of Anglo-Saxon stock, in the danger posed by what he called mongrel populations, in the need to preserve racial purity. These were not uncommon views in early 20th century America, particularly among old stock New Englanders who saw their cultural dominance threatened by waves of immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe. But Lovecraft embraced them with unusual fervor, developing elaborate theories about the biological basis of civilization. Yet at the same time, through his amateur journalism contacts, he was beginning to form friendships with people who were decidedly not old-stock Anglo-Saxons. His correspondence included Jews, Catholics, people whose ancestors came from the very countries he despised in the abstract. The contradiction seemed not to trouble him. He could maintain intense personal affection for individuals while holding on to racist theories about their ethnic groups. The people he knew were always exceptions, always somehow different from the degraded masses they theoretically belonged to. Through amateur journalism, he also met other aspiring writers who shared his interest in weird fiction. People like Frank Belknap Long, a young New Yorker who would become one of his closest friends. Through Long and others, Lovecraft began to reconnect with his earlier love of supernatural horror, the gothic tales his grandmother had read to him, the nightmares that had never entirely stopped. In 1917, he began writing weird fiction again, seriously, for the first time since childhood. The Tomb was his first mature attempt, a story about a man obsessed with an ancient burial vault, drawn to it in dreams, eventually discovering a connection to its long-dead inhabitants. It was derivative of Poe, stiff in its prose, uncertain in its effects, but it was a start. Then came Dagon, written in the summer of 1917, a much more successful story about a sailor who discovers a horror rising from the depths of the ocean, a creature of such vast antiquity and alienness that the mere sight of it drives him toward madness. Here was something new in Lovecraft's work, not just gothic atmosphere or psychological horror, but cosmic horror. The terror of realizing that humanity is insignificant, that older and vaster things exist beyond our knowledge, that the universe is fundamentally indifferent to our existence. Dagon pointed toward the direction his fiction would eventually take, though he didn't yet understand its implications. He submitted it to amateur journals, not to professional markets. He still didn't think of himself as a real writer, someone who could actually publish in paying magazines. Writing was a hobby, something he did for personal satisfaction and for the appreciation of his amateur journalism friends. His mother supported his writing to a degree, but also undermined it. She was proud when he received recognition in amateur circles, pleased when he was elected to positions in the amateur press associations. But she also continued to treat him as fragile, to discourage ambition, to keep him dependent on her. They lived together in the small house on Angel Street, bound in a relationship that was becoming increasingly unhealthy. Sarah Lovecraft's mental state was deteriorating. She had always been anxious and overprotective, but now her behavior was becoming more erratic. She suffered from what she called nervous attacks, periods of extreme agitation that required sedation. She became obsessed with her son's appearance, repeatedly telling him he was hideously ugly, that people stared at him in the street. There is no evidence this was true. Photographs from the period show a thin, rather ordinary-looking young man with a long face and prominent chin, certainly not handsome by conventional standards, but hardly monstrous. Yet her constant insistence on his ugliness affected him deeply. He began to avoid mirrors, to think of himself as physically repulsive. Combined with his social awkwardness and isolation, this made the idea of romantic relationships seem impossible. He was in his mid-20s, an age when most men of his era were married or courting, but he showed no interest in women beyond formal friendships in the amateur journalism circle. In 1919, his mother finally broke down completely. She was admitted to Butler Hospital, the same institution where his father had died 20 years earlier. She would remain there for the rest of her life, diagnosed with a combination of depression, hysteria, and nervous exhaustion. The real diagnosis, like his father's, probably involved syphilis that she had contracted from her husband before his breakdown, though this too was concealed from Howard. He visited her regularly at Butler Hospital, dutiful and concerned, but also perhaps relieved to have some distance from her suffocating presence. For the first time in his adult life, he was living without her constant supervision. He was 30 years old, living alone with his 2 elderly aunts, free to organize his life as he chose. With his mother institutionalized and his aunts making few demands on his time, Lovecraft entered the most productive period of his life so far. Between 1919 and 1921, he wrote some of his most significant early stories, developing the techniques and themes that would define his mature work. The Statement of Randolph Carter appeared in 1919, based directly on one of his recurring dreams. In it, a narrator describes how his friend Harley Warren descended into an ancient tomb or crypt, maintaining contact through a telephone wire until contact was broken with a final, terrible message. The story was simple, almost a sketch, but it captured something essential about Lovecraft's approach: the scholarly investigator, the forbidden knowledge, the sense of ancient evil lurking beneath the surface of the everyday world. Then came The Terrible Old Man and The Cats of Ulthar, both from 1920, developing his ability to create atmosphere through accumulation of suggestive detail rather than explicit description. He was learning to work through implication, to let readers' imaginations do the heavy lifting. The horror was more effective when glimpsed than when shown directly. But the real breakthrough came with The Outsider, written in 1921, one of his most personal and revealing stories. It describes a creature living alone in a castle with no memory of human contact, who journeys upward from darkness seeking the light and company of others, only to discover that he himself is a hideous corpse, a thing so repulsive that others flee in terror. The moment of recognition when the protagonist sees his reflection and realizes what he is, remains one of the most powerful passages in all of Lovecraft's work. Critics have read The Outsider as a metaphor for Lovecraft's own sense of alienation, his conviction that he was fundamentally different from normal people, separated by some unbridgeable gap. Whether he intended this consciously is unclear, but the emotional truth of the story is unmistakable. This was how he felt, isolated, different, convinced that if others truly saw him, they would recoil. Around the same time, he began work on The Call of Cthulhu, though he wouldn't complete it until 1926. The story represented a new direction in his thinking about horror fiction. Instead of ghosts or vampires or traditional gothic monsters, Lovecraft imagined something genuinely alien, a cosmic entity so ancient and vast that human beings were beneath its notice, yet whose very existence threatened to shatter our understanding of reality. The genius of The Call of Cthulhu lay in its structure. Rather than a single narrative, Lovecraft assembled his story from multiple documents: a sculptor's weird dreams, a police investigation of a cult in Louisiana, an encounter with something terrible in the Pacific Ocean. The reader pieces together the truth gradually, never getting a complete picture, forced to infer the larger pattern from fragmentary evidence. This approach served several purposes. It allowed Lovecraft to avoid direct description of the indescribable, letting readers imagine horrors more effective than any he could specify. It created a sense of vast conspiracy, of hidden knowledge scattered across time and geography, and it suggested that reality itself was vaster and stranger than consensus understanding admitted, that underneath the surface of everyday life lurked truths that could drive people mad. The theme of forbidden knowledge runs through all of Lovecraft's best work. His protagonists are typically scholars, investigators, antiquarians who stumble onto information they shouldn't have. The pursuit of knowledge itself becomes dangerous, because some truths are incompatible with sanity or continued existence. This was not a common theme in horror fiction of the period, which typically dealt with moral transgressions or supernatural evil in traditional religious terms. Lovecraft was doing something different. His horror was cosmic, not moral. His entities were not evil in the sense of choosing wrongdoing, but alien in the sense of being completely indifferent to human categories of good and evil. They existed according to their own nature, following laws we could barely comprehend, and if their activities destroyed humanity or drove people insane, this was incidental, like a human stepping on an anthill while walking through a forest. This vision emerged from his materialism, his understanding of the universe as revealed by modern science. He had read Darwin and understood evolution, read astronomy and understood cosmic time, read physics, and understood that the universe operated according to mechanical laws that had nothing to do with human welfare. The religious worldview that placed humanity at the center of creation, that posited a God who cared about human behavior, seemed to him demonstrably false. But if religion was false, if humans were just evolved animals on an insignificant planet, if the universe was indifferent to our existence, what happened to meaning? What happened to the values and hierarchies and traditions that Lovecraft held so dear? This was the contradiction at the heart of his worldview. He was a materialist who desperately wanted the universe to conform to 18th century values, a scientific rationalist who rejected modernity, an atheist who believed in aristocracy. His fiction became the space where he worked through this contradiction. His stories dramatized the consequences of materialism taken to its logical conclusion. If we are insignificant, if the universe is indifferent, if there are no transcendent values, then the discovery of this truth should be terrifying. The removal of comfortable illusions should feel like horror. Yet even as he wrote these stories, he was becoming less isolated in his actual life. The amateur journalism movement had given him a network of correspondents, people who appreciated his writing and wanted to engage with his ideas. Some of these correspondents were becoming real friends, though the friendships were maintained almost entirely through letters rather than in person. While Lovecraft was developing his craft in amateur journals, the commercial publishing world was undergoing a transformation. Pulp magazines, printed on cheap wood pulp paper and sold for a dime, were proliferating rapidly. They published all kinds of popular fiction: westerns, romance, detective stories, adventure tales, and increasingly, weird fiction. The most important of these for Lovecraft's future was Weird Tales, which began publication in 1923. Weird Tales was specifically devoted to supernatural horror and fantasy, creating a market for exactly the kind of stories Lovecraft was writing. But Lovecraft's relationship with the pulps was complicated from the start. He considered them vulgar commercial enterprises that catered to low tastes. Publishing in them meant compromising his standards. Yet he needed money. His tiny income from his grandfather's estate was barely sufficient to survive on. His mother was still alive but institutionalized at Butler Hospital, and he visited her regularly, a dutiful son despite the damage their relationship had caused. His aunts were aging and had their own financial limitations. If he wanted any kind of independence, any ability to travel or purchase books or simply have some security, he needed to earn something. His amateur journalism friends encouraged him to submit to the professional markets. Frank Belknap Long was particularly insistent, telling Lovecraft that his work was good enough for commercial publication. So in 1923, reluctantly, Lovecraft began submitting stories to Weird Tales. The magazine's first editor, Edwin Baird, rejected several of Lovecraft's submissions, but eventually accepted Dagon for the October 1923 issue. This was Lovecraft's first professional sale. He earned $5. The amount was insulting, far below what Weird Tales paid other contributors, but it was something. More importantly, it meant that someone outside his circle of amateur friends thought his work had commercial value. Over the next few years, Weird Tales would publish many of Lovecraft's best stories, though payment remained sporadic and inadequate. The magazine was perpetually on the verge of bankruptcy, often paying contributors months or even years late, sometimes not paying at all. Lovecraft complained bitterly about this in letters to friends, but he kept submitting work because there were few other markets for weird fiction. The pulp magazines operated under constraints that shaped the fiction they published. Stories had to be fast-paced, with clear resolutions and strong action. Editors wanted accessible prose, not Lovecraft's elaborate Latinate vocabulary and complex sentence structures. They wanted monsters that could be fought and defeated, not cosmic entities beyond human comprehension. They wanted horror that thrilled but didn't disturb too deeply. Lovecraft resisted these demands as much as he could. He refused to simplify his prose significantly, though he did learn to tighten his pacing somewhat. He refused to make his entities defeatable in conventional ways, though he sometimes provided ambiguous endings where protagonists escaped temporarily. He refused to explain everything explicitly, preferring to leave vast areas of suggestive uncertainty. This artistic stubbornness limited his commercial success. His stories were too weird even for Weird Tales, too intellectual, too gloomy. They didn't provide the kind of satisfying emotional release that most pulp readers wanted. Reading Lovecraft required work, required tolerance for ambiguity and abstraction, required willingness to feel genuinely disturbed rather than pleasantly frightened. The editor who understood this best was Farnsworth Wright, who took over Weird Tales in 1924. Wright appreciated Lovecraft's unique qualities but also recognized his commercial limitations. He published Lovecraft's work regularly, but also rejected many submissions, particularly the longer and more complex stories. At the Mountains of Madness, Lovecraft's longest and most ambitious work would be rejected by Wright and wouldn't see publication until years later. During this period, Lovecraft was also beginning to ghostwrite and revise stories for other writers who paid him directly. This work was more reliable financially than trying to sell his own stories to magazines. Clients would send him rough drafts or story ideas, and he would transform them into publishable fiction, taking a flat fee and allowing the client to publish under their own name. The revision work was artistically frustrating but financially necessary. It paid better and more reliably than his original fiction. Some clients gave him considerable freedom, allowing him to essentially write new stories based on their initial concepts. Others wanted minimal changes to their own prose. Lovecraft's ability to match his style to the client's needs showed his technical skill, but it also took time and energy away from his own work. Meanwhile, something unexpected was happening in his personal life. Through his amateur journalism connections, he had been corresponding with a woman named Sonia Green, a Russian Jewish immigrant living in New York City. She was 7 years older than Lovecraft, divorced, running her own hat shop, thoroughly modern in her attitudes and lifestyle. They began meeting in person when Lovecraft traveled to New York for amateur journalism conventions. The relationship developed into romance, improbable as that seemed. Lovecraft, who had shown no interest in women and who held deeply prejudiced views about Jews and immigrants, fell in love with a Jewish immigrant entrepreneur. Sonia was everything he theoretically despised. Foreign-born, commercially successful, independent, modern. Yet in practice, she was charming, intelligent, interested in literature, and apparently saw something valuable in this awkward, impoverished, reactionary writer. In 1921, Lovecraft's mother died in Butler Hospital. The official cause was complications from gallbladder surgery, but she had been deteriorating mentally and physically for years. Lovecraft was present at her death, the final encounter with the person who had shaped him more than anyone else, who had both loved him and damaged him in ways he was only beginning to understand. Her death freed him, to some degree, though he would never entirely escape her influence. He was now 31 years old, with no family responsibilities except his elderly aunts, free to remake his life if he chose. The question was whether he had the courage or desire to actually change. On March 3, 1924, Howard Phillips Lovecraft married Sonia Haft-Green in a civil ceremony in New York City. He was 33 years old, she was 40. For both of them, it was a second marriage, though Lovecraft's first had been to his mother rather than to another woman. The union was strange from the beginning, a collision of incompatible worldviews that somehow, briefly, produced genuine affection. Sonia was the opposite of everything Lovecraft had known. She was practical where he was impractical, energetic where he was lethargic, engaged with the modern world where he retreated into the 18th century. She ran a successful millinery business, employing workers, managing finances, navigating the commercial world with competence. She had traveled, had lived independently, had formed her own opinions about art and literature and politics. She was also Jewish, a fact that created cognitive dissonance in Lovecraft's mind that he never fully resolved. His anti-Semitic views were well established by this point, expressed freely in letters and essays. He considered Jews racially inferior, culturally destructive, incapable of true civilization. Yet here was Sonia, intelligent and cultured and successful, demonstrating through her very existence that his theories were nonsense. His response was to make an exception. Sonia wasn't like other Jews, he told himself and others. She was refined, had good taste, understood literature. The fact that she disproved his generalizations didn't cause him to question the generalizations themselves, but rather to create a special category for her. This was a pattern he would repeat with other Jewish friends and correspondents throughout his life. The marriage began hopefully. They moved into an apartment in Brooklyn, planning to establish a literary household where Lovecraft could write while Sonia's business supported them. She encouraged his writing, believed in his talent, thought he could become commercially successful if he just applied himself more systematically. She had the immigrant's faith in hard work and self-improvement, the conviction that anyone could succeed through effort. Lovecraft tried to adapt. He attempted to find regular employment, applying for various positions that might suit a man with no practical skills or work experience. He was rejected repeatedly, sometimes after single interviews where his awkwardness and unworldliness became immediately apparent. He had no idea how to present himself in a professional context, no ability to sell his capabilities, no practical skills that employers wanted. New York itself oppressed him. The city was everything he hated about modernity. Crowded, noisy, dirty, filled with immigrants speaking foreign languages, built at a scale that dwarfed individual humans. The architecture was commercial and modern, none of the Georgian proportions and colonial dignity he loved in Providence. The pace was relentless, everyone rushing, nobody contemplating. The poverty was visible and disturbing, human misery on display in a way that comfortable Providence concealed. He walked the streets and felt assaulted. The neighborhoods where immigrants clustered, particularly the Jewish and Italian areas, triggered his deepest prejudices. He saw them as invasions, as contaminations of American culture, as threats to the Anglo-Saxon civilization he idealized. The rhetoric in his letters from this period became more extreme, more violent in its imagery, fantasizing about purging the foreign elements from the nation. Yet he lived with a Jewish woman, depended on her financial support, accepted her love and care. The contradiction was unsustainable. Something had to break. What broke was Sonia's business. In 1925, her hat shop failed, a victim of economic recession and changing fashions. She lost her investment, her inventory, her income. Suddenly, instead of supporting Lovecraft while he pursued writing, she was unemployed herself, facing financial crisis. She found work in Cincinnati, managing a dress shop, but this meant leaving New York, leaving Lovecraft, living apart. The marriage was effectively over at that point, though the formal divorce wouldn't come until 1929. Lovecraft moved into a series of cheap apartments in Brooklyn and Manhattan, trying to survive on his meager income from writing and revision work. The experience was catastrophic. He was desperately poor, often going hungry, living in neighborhoods he considered alien and threatening, utterly isolated from anyone who understood him. His mental state deteriorated. The letters from this period show someone approaching breakdown, ranting about the racial composition of New York, describing nightmares where he was pursued through streets filled with hostile foreigners, contemplating suicide once again. The city was crushing him, exposing his complete inability to function in the modern world. He had no survival skills, no ability to navigate bureaucracy or commerce, no capacity to make himself useful to potential employers. He was a gentleman without means, a scholar without an institution, a writer who earned almost nothing from his writing. Everything he had been raised to be was now useless. The world had changed and left him behind. The 2 years Lovecraft spent living alone in New York, from 1925 to 1926, represented the lowest point of his life. He was approaching 40 years old, separated from his wife, estranged from his aunts back in Providence, living in tiny apartments in neighborhoods he found terrifying, barely surviving on irregular income from revision work and the occasional story sale. His living conditions were appalling. He rented rooms in the Red Hook section of Brooklyn, a heavily immigrant neighborhood that he described in letters with open horror and disgust. The building was run down. The other tenants were mostly recent arrivals from Southern and Eastern Europe. The streets were filled with what he considered alien presences. He felt surrounded and threatened, like the last representative of Anglo-Saxon America drowning in a sea of foreigners. The experience produced one of his most controversial stories, The Horror at Red Hook, written in 1925. It transformed his racist anxiety into supernatural horror, depicting Red Hook as a center of ancient evil where immigrant cultists conducted obscene rituals and summoned entities from beyond. The story is barely readable today, so laden with ethnic slurs and hateful caricatures that the plot almost disappears beneath the prejudice. Yet even this story reveals something important about Lovecraft's method. He took his personal anxieties, his phobias and fears, and transmuted them into cosmic horror. The immigrants were frightening to him, not just because of their foreignness, but because they represented change, the dissolution of the world he wanted to preserve. They were chaos invading order, modernity destroying tradition, the future erasing the past. Another story from this period, He, describes an unnamed narrator wandering the streets of New York, repulsed by the crowds and noise, encountering a mysterious figure who shows him visions of the city's colonial past. The story climaxes with a vision of the future, where New York lies in ruins, devoured by the very energies that made it thrive. It's a revenge fantasy, imagining the destruction of the city that was destroying him. But alongside these expressions of hatred and fear, Lovecraft was also producing some of his best pure horror fiction. The Shunned House was written during this period, drawing on his knowledge of Providence architecture and colonial history to create a story about ancestral evil lurking in the foundations of an old house. In the Vault demonstrated his ability to create visceral horror in a short space, describing an undertaker's nightmarish experience trapped overnight in a cemetery vault. He was learning to channel his neuroses into fiction more effectively, to transform personal terror into narrative structure. The writing became both therapy and survival strategy, a way to process experience that was otherwise overwhelming. But the writing wasn't providing financial stability. His income remained sporadic and inadequate. He tried various schemes to earn more money. He offered his services as a literary reviser through advertisements in writers' magazines, emphasizing his command of proper English and his knowledge of literary technique. He got some clients this way, people who needed their rough drafts polished into publishable form, but the work was inconsistent and paid poorly. He also attempted to place his own stories in better-paying markets than Weird Tales. He submitted work to more prestigious magazines, hoping for acceptance that would bring both money and validation. The rejections were uniform and devastating. Mainstream magazines wanted nothing to do with his elaborate horror stories, his archaic prose style, his refusal to provide conventional narrative satisfactions. His friends from the amateur journalism days remained loyal, particularly Frank Belknap Long and Samuel Loveman, who lived in New York and met with him regularly. These visits provided crucial human contact, opportunities to discuss literature and ideas with people who took him seriously. But they also highlighted his isolation. His friends had jobs, had girlfriends or wives, had normal social lives. Lovecraft had nothing but his writing and his increasingly desperate poverty. He began having vivid nightmares again, reminiscent of his childhood terrors. The night gaunts returned, those faceless winged creatures that pursued him through dark landscapes. He dreamed of alien cities, vast and ancient, built to proportions wrong for human habitation. He dreamed of being lost in crowds of hostile strangers, unable to escape, unable to make himself understood. Some of these dreams became stories. The Call of Cthulhu, completed during this period, drew partly on nightmares about non-Euclidean geometry and impossible architecture. The story's famous opening, about how humanity lives on a placid island of ignorance in the midst of black seas of infinity and ought not to voyage far, expressed his conviction that knowledge itself was dangerous, that some truths destroyed those who discovered them. The irony was that Lovecraft himself was one of those truth seekers, unable to stop himself from following ideas to their logical conclusions, even when those conclusions were unbearable. His materialism told him the universe was indifferent, humanity was insignificant. Values were illusions constructed to make existence tolerable. But he couldn't live comfortably with these truths. They haunted him. By early 1926, he was contemplating leaving New York permanently. The city had defeated him completely. He had come intending to make a new life, to support himself through writing, perhaps to maintain his marriage with Sonia despite their obvious incompatibilities. Instead, he had been crushed. The experience had proven that he was fundamentally unsuited for modern existence, incapable of surviving outside the protective environment of Providence. In April 1926, Howard Phillips Lovecraft returned to Providence, defeated but relieved. His aunts welcomed him back to the house on Angel Street, and he settled into an upstairs room that would serve as his residence for the rest of his life. He was 35 years old, his marriage was ending, his attempt to live independently had failed completely. By conventional measures, he had accomplished nothing. Yet the return to Providence marked the beginning of his greatest period of creative productivity. The New York experience, traumatic as it was, had provided material and perspective. He understood now what he could and couldn't do, what kind of life was possible for him. He would never be financially successful, never be conventionally employed, never be a normal member of society, but he could write, and he could do it from Providence. The city itself became his primary subject and inspiration. He began taking long walks through the colonial sections of Providence, studying the 18th century architecture he loved, exploring the old graveyards, researching the history of specific houses and streets. This research fed directly into his fiction, providing authentic historical detail that grounded his supernatural tales in particular locations. The Case of Charles Dexter Ward, written in 1927, was his first major work completed after returning to Providence. It's a novella-length story that weaves colonial Rhode Island history into a narrative about forbidden knowledge and ancestral evil. The protagonist discovers that his ancestor, Joseph Curwen, was involved in necromancy and obscene experiments in the 18th century, and that Curwen's influence extends into the present through occult means. The story showcases Lovecraft's antiquarian knowledge, his ability to recreate historical periods through accumulated detail. He describes specific Providence locations with the precision of a historian, creates documents in period-appropriate language, builds an atmosphere of scholarly investigation interrupted by horror. Charles Dexter Ward is both a historical novel and a supernatural thriller, demonstrating that the two modes could be combined effectively. But Weird Tales rejected it, and it wouldn't be published during Lovecraft's lifetime. The story was too long, too slow-paced, too lacking in conventional action. Lovecraft was disappointed, but not surprised. He understood by now that his best work was often his least commercial work, that the stories he cared about most were the ones editors rejected most consistently. He continued producing shorter stories for Weird Tales while working on more ambitious projects. The Color Out of Space, written in 1927, is often considered one of his finest achievements, a story about a meteorite that crashes on a Massachusetts farm and slowly corrupts everything it touches. The horror is genuinely alien, something outside human categories, impossible to understand or fight against. The story's power comes from its structure, the way Lovecraft builds dread through the testimonies of locals who witnessed events they cannot explain. The color itself, the thing that came in the meteorite, is described as being outside the normal spectrum of light, literally indescribable in human terms. This was Lovecraft at his best, using the limits of language to suggest realities beyond language. Around the same time, he wrote The Dunwich Horror, a more conventional tale by his standards, featuring a half-human monster that terrorizes rural Massachusetts before being destroyed by scholars who understand the occult forces at work. Weird Tales published it in 1929, and readers responded enthusiastically. It was exactly the kind of story the magazine wanted: atmospheric, frightening, but ultimately reassuring in its suggestion that evil could be comprehended and defeated. Lovecraft was developing a clearer sense of his own mythology, the interconnected stories that would later be called the Cthulhu mythos, though he never used that term himself. Stories referenced the same forbidden books, particularly the Necronomicon, a grimoire of ancient sorcery that Lovecraft had invented, but which readers sometimes believed was real. They mentioned the same cosmic entities: Cthulhu, Yog-Sothoth, Azathoth, Nyarlathotep. These entities were not gods in any traditional sense, but rather immensely powerful beings from other dimensions or ancient epochs, indifferent to humanity when they noticed us at all. They represented forces beyond human control or comprehension, reminders that the universe was vaster and stranger than our philosophies admitted. Other writers began incorporating elements of Lovecraft's mythology into their own stories, with his permission. Clark Ashton Smith, Robert E. Howard, August Derleth, and others referenced the Necronomicon or invoked Lovecraft's entities in their own weird tales. A collaborative mythology was emerging, shared among a circle of writers who corresponded regularly about their work. The mythology that would eventually be called the Cthulhu mythos was never planned as a coherent system. Lovecraft didn't set out to create a consistent cosmology like Tolkien would later do with Middle-earth. Instead, the recurring elements emerged organically from his stories, thrown in for atmospheric effect, reused because they worked well, gradually accumulating into something that resembled a unified vision. The Necronomicon was the centerpiece. Lovecraft invented this forbidden grimoire as a plot device in The Hound in 1922, giving it an Arabic title, Al-Azif, and attributing it to Abdul al-Hazred, the name he had used as a child when playing at being an Arabian scholar. The book supposedly contained knowledge of ancient entities and the rituals needed to summon them, knowledge so dangerous that reading it could drive people insane. In subsequent stories, Lovecraft added details. The Necronomicon was written in Damascus in 738 CE by the mad poet Abdul al-Hazred. It was translated into Greek in the 10th century, then into Latin in the 13th. The original Arabic text was lost, supposedly burned by authorities who understood its danger. Only a few copies of the Latin translation survived, scattered among the rare book collections of the world's great libraries. This false history was detailed enough that readers sometimes believed the book was real. Lovecraft received inquiries from people asking where they could obtain a copy. He found this amusing but also disturbing, since the whole point was that some knowledge should remain imaginary, that certain doors should stay closed. He had created the Necronomicon to suggest forbidden knowledge without actually providing it, and now people wanted the actual text. The entities mentioned in the Necronomicon and other forbidden tomes were Lovecraft's attempt to imagine something genuinely alien. Cthulhu, first described in The Call of Cthulhu, is depicted as a creature of vast size with a roughly anthropoid outline but with an octopus-like head, dragon wings, and a body covered in scales. It lies dreaming in a sunken city called Relia, waiting for the time when the stars are right and it can rise again. But Cthulhu is not a god in the sense of being worshipped for moral qualities or spiritual benefits. It is worshipped, if at all, because it exists, because it is powerful, because ignoring it would be dangerous when it awakens. The relationship between Cthulhu and its cultists is not one of love or devotion, but of recognition of superior force. Other entities filled out the pantheon. Yog-Sothoth was the key and the gate, something that existed outside normal space and time, capable of moving between dimensions. Azathoth was the blind idiot god at the center of the universe, a mindless chaos from which all reality emanated. Nyarlathotep was the crawling chaos, a messenger or avatar that took various forms and seemed to take active pleasure in tormenting humanity. These beings represented different aspects of cosmic indifference. Azathoth was pure meaninglessness. Yog-Sothoth was the incomprehensibility of higher dimensions. Nyarlathotep was the universe's casual cruelty. Together they formed a kind of anti-theology, a mythology built on the premise that the universe had no creator who cared about human welfare, no moral structure, no ultimate meaning. Lovecraft's friend and correspondent Robert E. Howard, creator of Conan the Barbarian, adopted some of these elements into his own stories. Clark Ashton Smith, a magnificent prose stylist whose weird tales were set in fantastical ancient worlds, also incorporated Lovecraftian references. August Derleth, who would later become Lovecraft's literary executor, was already writing stories that connected to the emerging mythology. What made the mythology effective was its ambiguity. Lovecraft never fully explained his cosmology, never created a definitive guide to the entities and their relationships. Different stories offered different perspectives, sometimes contradictory. Characters in the stories had fragmentary knowledge at best, pieced together from scattered sources, never quite understanding the full picture. This approach mirrored Lovecraft's philosophical conviction that human knowledge was fundamentally limited, that we could never fully comprehend the universe we inhabited. The cosmic entities represented truths that human minds could glimpse but not grasp, like flatlanders trying to understand three-dimensional geometry. The attempt to understand them fully was itself dangerous, because human psychology was not equipped to handle such knowledge. In The Whisperer in Darkness, written in 1930, Lovecraft introduced yet another threat: extraterrestrial beings from Yuggoth, identified with the planet Pluto, who had established a presence on Earth and were conducting obscure experiments. The story is told through letters and documents, building tension through epistolary revelation, showing the protagonist gradually realizing the extent of the alien presence and his own danger. The story ended ambiguously, with the protagonist possibly having been replaced by something wearing his form. This became a characteristic Lovecraft move, suggesting that the horror extended beyond the immediate narrative, that the protagonist's apparent escape might be illusory, that the reader couldn't trust even the narrative voice. While Lovecraft's fiction output remained relatively small, averaging only a few stories per year, his correspondence was monumental. He wrote letters constantly, often producing 5,000 or 10,000 words in a single day, creating what amounts to a vast informal autobiography conducted through epistolary exchange with dozens of correspondents. These letters were not casual notes, but substantial essays, carefully composed, addressing topics ranging from literature and philosophy to architecture and politics. Lovecraft treated letter writing as a serious literary form, something worth doing well for its own sake rather than merely as communication. Some letters ran to 20 or 30 pages, discussing in detail his theories of weird fiction or his observations on colonial American history. His correspondence ranged from other weird fiction writers to amateur journalists to young fans who had read his stories in Weird Tales and wanted to discuss them. He answered every letter he received, often at extraordinary length, providing detailed critiques of manuscripts sent to him, offering encouragement to aspiring writers, engaging seriously with questions about his work. Clark Ashton Smith was one of his most important correspondents, a poet and writer whose prose had a gorgeous decadence that Lovecraft admired even though it was very different from his own style. Robert E. Howard, living in rural Texas and writing adventure fiction about barbarian warriors, formed an unlikely friendship with the urbane New England antiquarian. August Derleth, a young writer from Wisconsin, became one of Lovecraft's most devoted correspondents and would later play a crucial role in preserving and publishing his work. Frank Belknap Long remained a close friend and correspondent throughout this period. They had known each other since the amateur journalism days, and Long was one of the few people who had visited Lovecraft during his difficult New York period. Their letters discuss writing technique, share news about publications and rejections, commiserate about the difficulty of earning a living from weird fiction. Robert Bloch, who would later write Psycho, began corresponding with Lovecraft as a teenage fan and received detailed advice about writing. Lovecraft took these teaching opportunities seriously, explaining his theories about how to create effective weird fiction, what distinguished true horror from mere sensationalism, how to build atmosphere through implication rather than explicit description. What emerges from the letters is a portrait of someone far more complex than the reclusive neurotic of biographical legend. Lovecraft could be generous, encouraging, intellectually curious, genuinely interested in helping other writers improve their craft. He could also be rigid, opinionated, convinced of his own correctness on matters of style and taste, dismissive of work that didn't meet his standards. His political views, expressed freely in letters, were often appalling. The racism that appeared occasionally in his published fiction was much more pronounced in his correspondence, where he felt free to express himself without editorial constraint. He wrote about immigration in apocalyptic terms, imagining racial contamination and cultural destruction, advocating for strict limits on who could enter the country and who deserved citizenship. Yet even here, contradictions appeared. His closest correspondents included people he theoretically considered racially inferior: Jews like Samuel Loveman, people of Italian or Greek descent, Catholics, immigrants. In practice, he judged people as individuals, forming genuine friendships that cut across the categories his theories insisted were absolute. The letter writing served multiple functions. It was social connection for someone who lived alone and rarely left Providence. It was intellectual stimulation, a way to engage with ideas and receive feedback. It was literary practice, keeping his prose skills sharp during periods when he wasn't writing fiction. And it was teaching, a way to formulate and clarify his theories about weird fiction by explaining them to others. But it also consumed enormous amounts of time that might have been spent on original fiction. Lovecraft wrote hundreds of thousands of words per year in letters, easily enough for multiple novels if that energy had been directed toward narrative fiction. His friends occasionally urged him to write less correspondence and more stories, to focus on work that could actually be published and paid for. He couldn't seem to do it. The letters were too important to him, too much a part of how he processed experience and maintained connection to the world beyond his Providence room. Writing fiction was difficult, often frustrating, frequently unrewarding financially. Writing letters was pleasurable, immediately gratifying, a way to feel useful and appreciated. The result was that his fiction output remained limited while his correspondence grew into a massive archive, tens of thousands of letters documenting his thoughts on virtually every subject. This archive would later prove invaluable to scholars and biographers, providing unprecedented detail about his life and ideas. But during his lifetime, it represented time not spent on the fiction that might have brought him the recognition he craved. To supplement his minimal income from original fiction, Lovecraft increasingly took on revision and ghostwriting work. This collaboration ranged from light editorial work to essentially writing entire stories for clients who provided only rough outlines or basic ideas. The work paid better than his original fiction and more reliably, though it raised questions about artistic integrity that Lovecraft never entirely resolved. His most extensive collaboration was with Harry Houdini, the famous magician and escape artist. Houdini wanted to publish weird fiction under his own name, capitalizing on his celebrity, but he lacked the literary skill to produce publishable work. Through a mutual acquaintance, he was put in touch with Lovecraft, who agreed to ghostwrite stories based on Houdini's general concepts. Imprisoned with the Pharaohs appeared under Houdini's byline in 1924, though Lovecraft wrote every word of it. The story describes Houdini's alleged experience being trapped beneath the Great Pyramid and witnessing a nightmarish ceremony involving ancient Egyptian monsters. It's pure pulp adventure, very different from Lovecraft's usual style, demonstrating his ability to write in a more accessible mode when paid to do so. The Houdini collaboration paid well by Lovecraft's standards, but ended when Houdini died in 1926. Other clients followed, bringing revision work that ranged from minor grammatical corrections to complete rewrites. Zealia Bishop sent Lovecraft several story ideas that he developed into full narratives, including The Curse of Yig and The Mound, keeping some of his characteristic themes while adapting to her initial concepts. The Mound, written for Bishop in 1929 to 1930, is one of Lovecraft's longest works, a novella about the discovery of an ancient underground civilization in Oklahoma. It showcases his ability to imagine alien cultures in detail, complete with their own histories, languages, and philosophies. The story was too long for Weird Tales and wouldn't see publication until after Lovecraft's death, but it represents some of his most ambitious world-building. Adolphe de Castro, another client, had rougher prose that required more extensive revision. Lovecraft essentially rewrote De Castro's stories while preserving the basic plots, transforming them into publishable weird fiction. The question of authorship in these cases was ambiguous. Lovecraft did the actual writing, but the initial ideas came from the clients. Who deserved the byline? Lovecraft's usual practice was to let clients publish under their own names while taking a flat fee for the work. This meant he received no ongoing royalties if the stories proved successful, but it also meant he avoided the complications of shared credit. The work was purely mercenary, done for money rather than artistic satisfaction, and he preferred to keep it separate from his own fiction. But some collaborations were more genuinely cooperative. With Robert H. Barlow, a young fan who became a close friend, Lovecraft worked on stories where they traded drafts back and forth, each contributing significantly to the final text. Barlow was deeply influenced by Lovecraft's style and often imitated it closely, making it difficult to determine who wrote specific passages. These collaborative relationships reveal something important about Lovecraft's character. Despite his often arrogant pronouncements about proper literary style, despite his conviction that most modern fiction was trash, he was willing to work with amateur writers, to take their rough ideas seriously, to help them produce publishable work. He could have dismissed these clients as beneath his notice, but instead he treated them professionally, did the work they paid for, and often went beyond what was strictly required. The revision work also kept him writing during periods when his own creative inspiration flagged. The discipline of completing assignments, of working to deadline and specification, maintained his craft even when he wasn't producing original fiction. And some of the collaborative stories allowed him to explore ideas and settings he might not have developed on his own. The Horror in the Museum, written for Hazel Heald, describes an encounter with preserved alien life forms in a private wax museum. The Diary of Alonzo Typer, written for William Lumley, explores the theme of ancestral evil through a diary format. These stories bear Lovecraft's stylistic fingerprints clearly, but address premises that came from his clients. The financial necessity behind this work was real and persistent. Lovecraft never earned enough from his own fiction to live on. Even in his most productive periods, his income from original stories averaged only a few $100s per year, nowhere near sufficient for survival. The revision work, combined with his tiny inherited income, made the difference between poverty and destitution. In early 1931, Lovecraft began work on his longest and most ambitious weird tale, At the Mountains of Madness. The novella would grow to nearly 40,000 words, far too long for weird tales in a single installment, and it represented his attempt to synthesize his cosmic philosophy into a unified narrative of discovery and horror. The story describes a scientific expedition to Antarctica that discovers the ruins of an ancient city built by alien beings millions of years before humans existed. These elder things had created life on Earth through biological experimentation, inadvertently giving rise to human evolution through a chain of consequences they never intended. The discovery reveals that humanity is not special, not created for any purpose, but rather an accidental byproduct of alien science. Lovecraft researched Antarctic exploration extensively, reading accounts of recent expeditions by Shackleton and Byrd, incorporating accurate geological and atmospheric detail to ground his fantastic narrative. The story is presented as a scientific report, written by a geologist trying to warn future expeditions away from the Antarctic plateau, and Lovecraft maintains this voice throughout, creating verisimilitude through technical precision. The horror in the story operates on multiple levels. There is immediate physical danger from the Shoggoths, amorphous creatures that serve the Elder Things as biological machines, but have since evolved their own primitive consciousness and turned against their creators. But the deeper horror is existential, the realization that human history is cosmically insignificant, that we are the unintended consequence of processes we cannot control or fully understand. The Elder Things themselves are rendered sympathetically despite their alienness. They are scientists and artists, builders and explorers, recognizable as intelligent beings even though their biology and psychology are profoundly non-human. When the protagonists discover the frozen bodies of Elder Things killed by Shoggoths, they feel a kind of kinship with these ancient beings who struggled against chaos and entropy just as humans do. This was new in Lovecraft's work. The suggestion that cosmic entities might not be entirely incomprehensible, that some form of understanding or even empathy might be possible across vast evolutionary distances. The Elder Things are not gods or demons but scientists, and their civilization, though alien, followed patterns that human scientists could partially grasp. But the story also contains one of Lovecraft's most famous passages, describing the expedition's final discovery in the mountains, certain cubes and cylinders of a design quite unlike anything else we had seen, a line of low cliffs on the farther side of the plateau, and suddenly our eyes were arrested by the sight of an immense, seemingly pyramidal structure of what appeared to be black opaque rock, rising to a height of some 500 feet and casting enormous shadows over the frozen terrain. The prose continues for pages, building through accumulated detail toward the moment when the protagonists understand what they are seeing. A city of impossible age and scale, built to house creatures for whom human proportions were meaningless. Lovecraft submitted At the Mountains of Madness to Weird Tales in 1931, expecting it to be published despite its length. Farnsworth Wright rejected it. The story was too long, too slow-paced, too lacking in traditional horror elements. It was a scientific romance, Wright complained, not a weird tale. The creatures weren't frightening enough. The narrative spent too much time on geological description and not enough on action. The rejection devastated Lovecraft. He considered At the Mountains of Madness his finest achievement, the story that best expressed his vision of cosmic horror. He had worked harder on it than on anything else he had written, had researched it more thoroughly, had crafted its sentences with more care, and the premier market for weird fiction had turned it down. He tried other markets without success. Astounding Stories, a science fiction pulp, considered it but ultimately declined. The story wouldn't see publication until 1936, when Astounding finally accepted it under a new editor. By then, Lovecraft had less than a year to live. The rejection of At the Mountains of Madness confirmed what Lovecraft already suspected. His best work was too uncommercial for the pulp markets, too weird even for weird tales. He could write stories that satisfied his artistic standards, or stories that earned money, but not both simultaneously. The choice seemed inevitable. Any honest account of Lovecraft must confront his racism directly. This was not a minor flaw or a product of his era that can be explained away. Lovecraft held racist views with unusual intensity, expressed them frequently and viciously, and built some of those views into his fiction in ways that are impossible to ignore or excuse. He believed that Nordic and Anglo-Saxon peoples were superior to all others in intelligence, creativity, and capacity for civilization. He considered miscegenation a threat to racial purity and advocated for strict immigration controls to prevent what he saw as the degradation of American stock. He used ethnic slurs freely in his letters, describing immigrants in dehumanizing language, imagining their presence as a kind of invasion or contamination. Some of his fiction makes these views explicit. The Street describes a pleasant Anglo-Saxon neighborhood destroyed by an influx of immigrants who bring dirt, crime, and foreign radicalism. The Horror at Red Hook depicts immigrant communities as literally demonic, centers of ancient evil where non-white people conduct blasphemous rituals. The racism is not subtext but text, blatant and ugly. His poem On the Creation of written in 1912 is so viciously racist that it remains shocking to read even now. The casual dehumanization, the contempt, the certainty of superiority, all expressed in formal verse as if racial hatred were a suitable subject for poetry. This was Lovecraft at his worst, his prejudices undiluted by any restraint or reflection. Yet the contradictions were profound. His close friend Samuel Loveman was Jewish. His mentor in poetry, Hart Crane, was homosexual, another group Lovecraft theoretically despised. His wife Sonia was a Russian Jewish immigrant, precisely the kind of person his theories identified as racially inferior and culturally destructive. In practice, he formed genuine friendships with people his ideology said he should shun. His response to this contradiction was to create exceptions, to insist that the individuals he knew personally were somehow different from the degraded masses they belonged to. This is a common psychological defense, allowing people to maintain prejudiced generalizations while treating specific individuals as atypical. But it also created a tension in his thinking that he never resolved. In his later years, his racism became somewhat less extreme, though it never disappeared entirely. His letters from the 1930s show him questioning some of his earlier certainties, acknowledging that crude biological determinism might not explain everything. He began reading anthropology more seriously, encountering evidence that complicated his simple racial hierarchies. His friendship with Robert E. Howard, a Texan who despised Yankee elitism and celebrated the vitality of mongrel populations, challenged Lovecraft's assumptions. Their letters debated these issues extensively, with Howard arguing that racial mixing often produced superior individuals and that Anglo-Saxon culture had its own severe limitations. Lovecraft defended his positions but seemed less certain than in earlier years. The question of how to evaluate Lovecraft's work given his racism has no simple answer. Some readers find the prejudice so pervasive and disturbing that they cannot enjoy the stories at all, seeing the cosmic horror as merely a mask for racial anxiety. Others argue that the best of his work transcends its creator's limitations, that stories like The Color Out of Space or The Whisperer in Darkness have value independent of his biography. What seems clear is that Lovecraft's horror fiction did draw energy from his fears about racial and cultural change. The sense of being displaced, of watching a familiar world dissolve, of confronting alien presences that threatened to overwhelm established order, these anxieties had real biographical sources in his response to immigration and modernity. The cosmic indifference he imagined was partly a projection of his fear that the world was indifferent to the values he held dear. But the best of his work exceeds that limited origin. The horror he created was genuinely cosmic, not merely ethnic. The entities in his stories represent something larger than racial anxiety, the indifference of the universe itself, the inadequacy of human understanding, the fragility of reason when confronted with truths it cannot accommodate. These themes have resonance independent of Lovecraft's personal prejudices. The contradictions in his character remain unresolved. He was capable of generosity and spite, intellectual honesty and blind prejudice, genuine insight and foolish bigotry. He helped young writers while despising most of humanity. He formed deep friendships while maintaining theories that should have prevented such connections. He wrote stories of cosmic scope while obsessing over provincial hierarchies. Human beings contain contradictions, and Lovecraft contained more than most. The challenge for readers and scholars is to acknowledge both his achievements and his failures, to recognize the value of his fiction without sanitizing his biography, to understand the historical context while refusing to excuse the inexcusable. Despite his reclusiveness and social anxiety, Lovecraft was not entirely isolated during his Providence years. He had connections to a local literary circle called the Column Club, named after its founding members using their initials. The group met regularly to discuss literature, share writings, and maintain intellectual fellowship. For Lovecraft, it provided rare face-to-face interaction with people who shared his interests. The club's membership was small and fluctuating, never more than a dozen active participants. Some members were aspiring writers, others simply appreciated literature and enjoyed discussion. Lovecraft attended meetings when his health and mood permitted, contributing essays and poetry, engaging in debates about literary standards and technique. These gatherings were formal affairs by modern standards, with prepared presentations and structured discussions rather than casual conversation. This format suited Lovecraft perfectly. He could prepare remarks in advance, speak from knowledge rather than spontaneously, avoid the small talk and social improvisation he found so difficult. Within the club's structure, he could function almost normally. He also formed individual friendships within the group, people he would meet for walks around Providence or for visits to his room on Angel Street. These friendships were important to him, providing human contact that mitigated his isolation. But they were also carefully managed, conducted according to his preferences, never demanding more social engagement than he could tolerate. C.M. Eddy Jr. was one of these friends, a younger man interested in weird fiction who sought Lovecraft's mentorship. Lovecraft provided extensive revision help on Eddy's stories, essentially ghostwriting some of them while encouraging Eddy to develop his own skills. The relationship was typical of Lovecraft's generous impulses toward younger writers, his willingness to invest time in helping others improve. But Lovecraft's most important connection during this period was with Robert Barlow, a teenage fan from Florida who began corresponding with him in 1931. Barlow was precociously talented, deeply interested in weird fiction, and eager to learn from Lovecraft. Their correspondence quickly became extensive, and eventually Barlow traveled to Providence to meet Lovecraft in person. The meeting was successful beyond expectation. Barlow was respectful, intellectual, interested in the same obscure topics that fascinated Lovecraft. He represented a kind of ideal protege, someone who could absorb Lovecraft's literary theories and carry them forward. They began collaborating on stories, with Barlow often taking dictation as Lovecraft composed, then revising drafts together. Lovecraft eventually visited Barlow's family in Florida, staying for extended periods, enjoying the warmer climate and the attention of an entire household that treated him as an honored guest. These visits provided respite from Providence winters and from the isolation of his usual routine. Barlow's family was wealthy enough to make Lovecraft comfortable without making him feel like a charity case. The relationship raised eyebrows among some of Lovecraft's correspondents, who wondered about its nature. Lovecraft was in his 40s, Barlow was a teenager. They shared a bedroom during Lovecraft's visits to Florida, though there is no credible evidence that the relationship was sexual. By all accounts, it was a literary mentorship that happened to involve unusual intimacy and mutual dependence. Barlow would later become Lovecraft's literary executor, inheriting his manuscripts and papers, and would spend years trying to preserve and promote Lovecraft's work. The relationship was one of the most significant of Lovecraft's life, providing emotional support and intellectual companionship during his final years. Meanwhile, Lovecraft maintained his vast correspondence with dozens of other writers and fans. The letter writing continued to consume enormous amounts of time and energy, producing hundreds of thousands of words annually. Some correspondents received letters weekly, others monthly, but all received thoughtful, substantial responses to their questions and comments. This network of correspondence created a kind of invisible college, a community of weird fiction enthusiasts scattered across America and even internationally, bound together by shared interests and Lovecraft's energetic participation. He was the hub of this network, connecting people to each other, sharing news about publications and opportunities, offering critiques and encouragement. The irony was that Lovecraft was far more influential as a correspondent and mentor than as a published author. His stories appeared only sporadically in Weird Tales and were read by perhaps a few thousand people at most. But his letters reached hundreds of correspondents, many of whom shared them with others or preserved them as valuable documents. His ideas about weird fiction circulated through this network, shaping how other writers approached the genre. Providence itself was as much a character in Lovecraft's life as any person. He walked the city constantly, exploring its colonial neighborhoods, sketching architectural details, researching the histories of specific houses. The 18th century buildings represented everything he valued: order, proportion, connection to tradition, physical embodiment of a civilization he idealized. His favorite walk led up College Hill to the historic East Side, where colonial houses still stood, much as they had been built 2 centuries earlier. He could identify architectural periods and styles at a glance, distinguish Federal from Georgian, identify later modifications to original structures. This knowledge was not academic but passionate, tied to his sense of identity and belonging. He wrote essays about Providence architecture, documenting houses that were threatened with demolition, advocating for preservation of the city's colonial heritage. These essays combined historical research with aesthetic appreciation and cultural politics. For Lovecraft, preserving old buildings was about maintaining connection to a superior past, preventing modernity from erasing everything valuable. The house at 135 Benefit Street, the Halsey House, particularly fascinated him. Built in 1765, it exemplified the Georgian style he admired, with its formal proportions and restrained decoration. He visited it repeatedly, studying its details, incorporating it into his mental map of ideal Providence. When it was threatened with demolition in the 1920s, he mourned its potential loss as a personal tragedy. His story, The Shunned House, was based on a real Providence building at 135 Benefit Street, though the actual house had no supernatural history. Lovecraft took its physical appearance and location, then invented a narrative of generations cursed by something lurking in the cellar. The story demonstrates his method. Start with accurate historical and architectural detail, then introduce the weird element, using verisimilitude to make the impossible seem plausible. The case of Charles Dexter Ward is set extensively in specific Providence locations, with real streets and actual historical sites woven into the narrative. Readers familiar with Providence could follow the protagonist's movements through the city, recognizing landmarks, understanding the geography. This anchoring in real place gave the supernatural elements extra weight, suggesting that the division between reality and horror might be thinner than assumed. Lovecraft's architectural obsessions reflected deeper psychological needs. The old houses represented stability, continuity, connection to something permanent. They had survived for centuries while everything else changed. They embodied values and aesthetics that modernity seemed to be abandoning. By studying them, by documenting them, by incorporating them into his fiction, he was trying to preserve something that felt endangered. But there was also something morbid in his attachment to the past. He preferred dead things to living ones, buildings to people, the 18th century to the 20th. His ideal Providence was essentially a museum, preserved exactly as it had been, with no modern intrusions, no contemporary life disturbing the historical purity. This was not a sustainable relationship with the past, but a rejection of the present. His walks through Providence were solitary affairs, conducted mostly at night when the streets were empty, and he could imagine the city as it might have been in colonial times, without automobiles or electric lights or modern crowds. He was practicing a kind of time travel, mentally removing everything that didn't fit his preferred era, inhabiting an imaginary Providence that never quite existed. This habit extended to his writing. Many of his stories are set in fictional New England towns that resemble Providence but are frozen in earlier periods or hidden from modernity. Arkham, Innsmouth, Dunwich, these invented locations allowed him to create worlds where the past wasn't gone, where colonial architecture still dominated, where the modern world hadn't penetrated. Despite his cultural conservatism, Lovecraft maintained a rigorous scientific materialism throughout his life. He read Scientific American and astronomy journals, stayed current with new discoveries in physics and biology, understood that science was the only reliable method for understanding how the universe actually worked. This created a fascinating tension with his love of supernatural horror fiction. He resolved the contradiction by arguing that weird fiction was not about belief in the supernatural, but about psychological effect. The point was not to convince readers that ghosts or cosmic entities actually existed, but to create a specific emotional response, the feeling of confronting something beyond normal categories of understanding, the sensation of reality becoming unstable. His materialism was absolute. He rejected all religious claims, considered the soul a fiction, thought consciousness was simply a product of brain function that ceased at death. The universe was matter in motion, following mechanical laws, with no purpose or direction. Human beings were evolved animals, no different in kind from any other species, destined for eventual extinction when the sun died or some other cosmic event ended conditions suitable for life. This worldview should have made horror fiction impossible for him. If nothing supernatural exists, if the universe contains only matter and energy operating according to natural law, what is there to be horrified by? Lovecraft's answer was, the universe itself, properly understood. The cosmos revealed by modern science was more terrifying than any ghost story because it was real. The vastness of space and time, the insignificance of humanity, the indifference of natural processes to human welfare, these were the real horrors. A human lifetime was a blink, human civilization was a moment. The entire span of human existence would leave no permanent trace in a cosmos that would continue for billions of years after our extinction. This was the truth his stories were designed to evoke. He saw his weird fiction as a kind of thought experiment. What if we took seriously the implications of scientific materialism? What if we really absorbed the lesson that humanity is not special, that our existence is accidental, that we are cosmically insignificant? The emotional response should be horror, or at least profound unease. His stories tried to produce that response. At the same time, he was fascinated by science fiction, particularly the possibilities opened by astronomical research. He read H.G. Wells enthusiastically, admired stories that took science seriously while imagining its consequences. His own At the Mountains of Madness was essentially hard science fiction mixed with horror, using accurate Antarctic geography and plausible biological speculation to ground its fantastic elements. But he rejected the optimistic technological progressivism common in much science fiction. Where other writers imagined humanity spreading across the galaxy, conquering alien worlds, achieving utopian futures through technological advancement, Lovecraft saw only hubris. We were not destined for greatness, but for extinction. Our technological achievements mere temporary complications before the inevitable collapse. This pessimism extended to his view of human nature. He didn't believe in moral progress, didn't think humanity was becoming more enlightened or civilized over time. History was cyclical at best, more likely just meaningless fluctuation. The idea that the present era was superior to the past, that modernity represented advance over tradition, struck him as absurd liberal delusion. Yet he lived in a period of extraordinary scientific and technological achievement. Aviation, radio, motion pictures, quantum physics, relativity theory all emerged during his lifetime. The pace of change was accelerating. The modern world he rejected was producing discoveries and capabilities that would have seemed like magic to earlier generations. His response was to ignore most of it. He refused to fly in airplanes, rarely listened to radio, didn't attend motion pictures, showed minimal interest in contemporary technology. He used the public library rather than purchasing books, wrote in longhand rather than using a typewriter, lived as simply as his limited means required but also as he preferred. This deliberate archaism was partly practical. He was too poor for modern conveniences, but partly philosophical. He didn't want to engage with modernity any more than necessary. The 18th century remained his spiritual home, the period whose values and aesthetics he tried to embody. That it was irrevocably gone, that he was born 2 centuries too late, was the tragedy underlying his entire existence. By the mid-1930s, Lovecraft's health was deteriorating. He had always been subject to mysterious ailments, psychosomatic or real, that kept him confined to his room for days or weeks at a time. But now the problems were becoming more persistent and severe. He suffered from digestive issues, chronic pain, increasing fatigue. He attributed these to nerves, to the cold Providence winters, to his irregular eating habits. The reality was cancer, though he didn't know it yet. Intestinal cancer was growing inside him, untreated and undiagnosed, gradually destroying his health while he continued writing letters and planning stories that would never be completed. His fiction output slowed dramatically. He completed The Shadow Out of Time in 1935, a novella about a professor whose consciousness is displaced by an alien entity for years, eventually discovering that he has been transported millions of years into the past to a civilization of vast-lived beings who study all of history. The story showcases his ability to imagine truly alien intelligence, beings whose concerns and methods are barely comprehensible to human understanding. It was also one of his last major works. The creative energy that had sustained him through the late 1920s and early 1930s was fading. Part of this was physical, the cancer sapping his strength. Part was psychological, the accumulated weight of failure and rejection making it harder to summon enthusiasm for projects that would probably never earn him recognition or money. Weird Tales continued publishing his work sporadically, but payment was always late and always inadequate. His revision work brought in some income, but even that was declining as economic depression limited what clients could pay. He lived on almost nothing, surviving month to month through careful management of his tiny inherited income and whatever revision fees came in. His letters from this period show increasing awareness of his own isolation and failure. He had been writing seriously for nearly 2 decades, had produced some of the most original weird fiction in the English language, and he remained almost completely unknown outside a small circle of pulp magazine readers and amateur writers. His work had influenced other writers, but always through private channels, correspondence, and conversation, never through widespread publication. He contemplated what would happen to his work after his death. He had no illusions about immediate fame, understood that his stories might simply disappear entirely if no one took responsibility for preserving them. August Derleth had been urging him for years to collect his stories into book form, arguing that a permanent edition would establish his reputation more firmly than magazine publication. Lovecraft resisted this suggestion, partly from inertia, partly from conviction that his work wasn't good enough for book publication, partly from the practical difficulty of finding a publisher willing to invest in a collection of weird tales by an unknown author. The economics of book publishing in the Depression were brutal, and publishers of weird fiction barely existed. In 1936, At the Mountains of Madness finally appeared in Astounding Stories, serialized across 3 issues. This was some vindication of the story Weird Tales had rejected 5 years earlier, but it came too late to revive Lovecraft's creative energy or significantly improve his financial situation. He was increasingly preoccupied with physical suffering and the practical challenge of simply surviving. His correspondence continued, though even that became more difficult as his health declined. He still wrote long, thoughtful letters to dozens of correspondents, still offered encouragement to young writers, still engaged with ideas about literature and philosophy. But the letters began to mention his health problems more frequently, to acknowledge his exhaustion and pain. He visited Robert Barlow in Florida one last time in early 1935, seeking warmth and respite from Providence winter. The visit was pleasant, but couldn't arrest his physical decline. When he returned to Providence, he was noticeably weaker, moving with difficulty, eating little. By late 1936, he could no longer deny that something was seriously wrong. The pain was constant, the weight loss severe. Finally, in March 1937, he consulted a doctor, something he had avoided for years, both from fear of what might be discovered and from inability to pay for medical care. The diagnosis was devastating. Cancer of the small intestine, advanced and inoperable. There was nothing to be done except manage pain. He had weeks, perhaps a few months to live. He was 46 years old. Howard Phillips Lovecraft died on March 15, 1937, in Jane Brown Memorial Hospital in Providence. The immediate cause was listed as intestinal cancer, though he had also developed Bright's disease, a kidney condition, and was malnourished from his inability to eat properly in his final months. He died in considerable pain, though sedation provided some relief toward the end. His funeral was small, attended by a handful of local friends and his aunts. There were no literary luminaries, no representatives from magazines that had published his work, no recognition that someone significant had passed. He was buried in the Phillips family plot at Swan Point Cemetery, initially with only a small marker since there was no money for a proper headstone. His death was noted briefly in the local Providence newspaper, described as that of a local author and poet, no suggestion that his work might outlast him. Weird Tales published a short obituary mentioning some of his stories, but there was no extensive tribute, no special issue dedicated to his memory. He had simply been one of their regular contributors, now gone. August Derleth and Donald Wandrei, two of his correspondents who were also aspiring writers, immediately began working to preserve his legacy. They gathered his scattered stories, many of which existed only in fragile pulp magazine pages, and began the process of trying to get them published in book form. This was the beginning of what would become a lifelong mission for Derleth. Derleth and Wandrei founded Arkham House, a small press specifically created to publish Lovecraft's work in permanent editions. Their first volume, The Outsider and Others, appeared in 1939, collecting Lovecraft's best stories in hardcover for the first time. The print run was small, only 1,268 copies, and sales were slow. But the book existed, a physical demonstration that Lovecraft's work could survive beyond the pulps. Robert Barlow inherited Lovecraft's literary papers, thousands of pages of manuscripts and letters. He began cataloging them, recognizing their importance not just as literature, but as historical documents. Lovecraft had been an extraordinarily prolific correspondent, and his letters provided unprecedented detail about his life, thoughts, and creative process. But in 1937, all of this preservation work lay in the future. Immediately after Lovecraft's death, his reputation seemed likely to fade quickly. He had published no books during his lifetime. His stories were scattered across old issues of Weird Tales and other pulp magazines, most of which were already difficult to find. He had influenced other writers through correspondence, but that influence was private, invisible to any broader literary culture. The conventional assessment of his career would have been failure. He had spent his adult life writing fiction that earned him almost nothing. He had lived in poverty, dependent on tiny inherited income and occasional revision work. He had never married successfully, had no children, had left behind no obvious mark on the world. His attempts at normal employment had failed completely. By middle-class standards, he had accomplished nothing. Yet within 20 years of his death, his reputation would begin to grow. The Arkham House editions would keep his work in print, introducing new readers to his distinctive vision. Other writers would acknowledge his influence more openly, incorporating elements of his mythology into their own work. Critics would begin to recognize that his cosmic horror represented something genuinely original, not just derivative Gothic fiction, but a new approach to understanding terror. The process would be slow and uneven. There would be setbacks, periods when his work seemed doomed to remain cultish and marginal. But gradually, persistently, the reputation would build. College students would discover him, scholars would write dissertations about him, prestigious publishers would issue new editions of his work. By the late 20th century, Lovecraft would be recognized as one of the most influential horror writers in the English language. His invented mythology would be absorbed into popular culture, referenced in films, games, comics, novels by other authors. His name would be known to millions who had never read his actual stories, his creatures and forbidden books becoming part of our collective imagination. The transformation of Howard Phillips Lovecraft from forgotten pulp writer to literary icon took decades and involved the efforts of numerous people who recognized the value of his work when the broader culture did not. August Derleth deserves much of the credit, though his role remained controversial. Derleth had been one of Lovecraft's most devoted correspondents and had learned from him extensively about weird fiction technique. After Lovecraft's death, Derleth essentially dedicated his life to promoting Lovecraft's work, even when doing so brought minimal financial reward. Arkham House published not only Lovecraft's own stories but also fiction by other writers working in similar modes, creating a market for cosmic horror. But Derleth also made decisions that troubled later scholars. He took fragments and story ideas from Lovecraft's notes and completed them himself, publishing the results as Lovecraft collaborations. The quality of these posthumous collaborations was uneven, and many readers felt they diluted Lovecraft's actual work. Derleth also imposed his own interpretations on Lovecraft's mythology, systematizing it in ways Lovecraft had deliberately avoided. Most controversially, Derleth tried to impose Christian moral categories onto Lovecraft's cosmic horror, suggesting that entities like Cthulhu represented evil in a religious sense and could be opposed by good. This fundamentally misunderstood Lovecraft's materialist worldview, his conviction that the universe had no moral structure, his creation of entities that were alien rather than evil. Despite these complications, Arkham House kept Lovecraft's work available during the crucial decades after his death, when it might otherwise have disappeared entirely. The small press editions became collector's items, sought after by fans willing to pay premium prices for hardcover collections that major publishers wouldn't touch. By the 1960s, Lovecraft was being discovered by the counterculture, by young readers attracted to his alienation and his rejection of conventional values. His cosmic horror appealed to people questioning established religion and traditional worldviews. His outsider status, his failure to achieve commercial success during his lifetime, made him a romantic figure. Academic interest followed. Critics began recognizing that Lovecraft had done something original, that his best work transcended its pulp origins. Scholars started writing serious analyses of his fiction, placing it in philosophical and literary contexts, comparing him to authors far outside the genre ghetto. The first academic conferences dedicated to his work appeared in the 1970s. Meanwhile, his influence on other writers became increasingly obvious. Stephen King acknowledged Lovecraft as a major influence, incorporating Lovecraftian elements into his own work. Ramsey Campbell, Thomas Ligotti, Laird Barron, and other horror writers worked explicitly within the tradition Lovecraft had established. In science fiction, authors from China Miéville to Jeff Vandermeer drew on Lovecraft's creation of genuinely alien entities. The Cthulhu mythos became a shared universe, with dozens of writers contributing stories that referenced Lovecraft's creations. This collaborative mythology grew far beyond anything Lovecraft had imagined, incorporating elements he never invented, developing in directions he wouldn't have approved, but it kept his name alive and introduced new readers to his original work. Film adaptations appeared, though most were loose interpretations rather than faithful renditions. Lovecraft's fiction resisted cinematic adaptation because so much of its power came from implication and suggestion rather than visual spectacle. Showing Cthulhu directly usually made it less frightening than leaving it to the reader's imagination. Nevertheless, films like Reanimator and In the Mouth of Madness captured something of Lovecraft's spirit even when departing from his specific stories. By the beginning of the 21st century, Lovecraft had achieved the kind of cultural penetration that seemed impossible during his lifetime. His invented words, Cthulhu and Necronomicon, were recognized by millions. His themes appeared in video games, graphic novels, role-playing games, music. The Library of America, America's most prestigious publisher of canonical literature, included Lovecraft in its series, a stamp of literary legitimacy that would have astonished him. Yet this success came with new complications. As Lovecraft's work reached broader audiences, his racism became more widely known and more seriously condemned. Readers who had valued his cosmic horror were disturbed to discover the ethnic hatred in some stories, and particularly in his letters. The World Fantasy Award, which had featured a bust of Lovecraft as its trophy, was redesigned after campaigns highlighting his racist views. The question of how to evaluate an author whose fiction is valuable but whose personal views were reprehensible has no simple answer. Some argue for complete separation, judging the work independent of the biography. Others insist that an author's moral character must be considered alongside literary achievement. Still others see Lovecraft as a useful case study in how great art can emerge from flawed people, how creativity and prejudice can coexist. What seems beyond dispute is that Lovecraft achieved posthumously what he never achieved in life: recognition as a major figure in American literature, influence extending far beyond the genre ghetto where he published. The cosmic horror he invented, the mythology he created, the themes he explored, all proved to have lasting power, resonating with readers decades after his death. The house at 135 Benefit Street still stands in Providence, marked now with a plaque identifying it as the location that inspired The Shunned House. Tourists visit seeking connections to Lovecraft's fiction, walking the streets he walked, photographing buildings he described. Swan Point Cemetery maintains his grave as a minor pilgrimage site for fans. Providence itself has embraced him as a native son, despite his complicated relationship with the city. The Providence Athenaeum, the library where he spent countless hours, displays Lovecraft materials. Local bookstores feature sections dedicated to his work and books about him. An annual convention brings together scholars and fans to discuss his fiction and legacy. The irony would not have been lost on Lovecraft himself. He spent his life feeling displaced, born into the wrong era, unable to fit into the modern world. He imagined himself as the last remnant of a dying civilization, preserving values that nobody else cared about anymore. He died in obscurity, convinced that his work would be forgotten. Instead, he became one of the most influential writers of supernatural fiction in the English language. His stories translated into dozens of languages, his mythology absorbed into global popular culture, his name known to millions. The recognition came too late for him to enjoy it, too late to rescue him from poverty and isolation, too late to give him the literary companionship he craved. But it came nonetheless, a strange redemption for a life that seemed, in its own moment, like complete failure. The man who felt himself to be fundamentally alien, separated from humanity by temperament and conviction, created fiction that spoke to human fears and curiosities across generations. The writer who published only in cheap pulp magazines became the subject of scholarly conferences and critical studies. Howard Phillips Lovecraft, who lived small and died obscure, left behind monsters that will not die, a mythology that continues to grow, and stories that continue to disturb and fascinate readers more than 80 years after his death. He wanted to be remembered as a gentleman of the 18th century, born out of his time. Instead, he is remembered as the creator of cosmic horror, the writer who showed us the terror lurking in the indifferent universe revealed by modern science. That is perhaps its own kind of cosmic irony. Exactly the sort of unexpected twist that appears in his own best stories. The outsider who felt himself excluded from life achieved a kind of immortality, not through the aristocratic bloodlines he fantasized about, but through imagination, through words arranged on pages, through ideas that proved more durable than he ever imagined possible.